Doctor Leroy Brown has always looked up to his stepfather, Bill Pevensey, a gentle giant with a passion for literature. However, on Bill's deathbed, a few whispered words shatter Leroy's perception, hinting at a sinister truth lurking beneath the surface. The Cat from Ulthar, by Sinclair. A familiar scene, a normal scene, a hospital room, and a very old man in the final bed he will ever be lying in. The old man presents a sight that most people are thankfully not familiar with, or even imagine. It's the devastating and ghastly effects extreme old age and bad illness have on males who have been extremely big and powerful for most of their lives. The remains of evidence of great height. If he was to stand, the breadth of shoulders, and other length of bone only emphasize how frail he now is, and show what's gone. The hands on the coverlet are still like shovels, but they have a translucent look to them. He's still got the remains of what was once long blonde hair and beard, but now they are gossamer thin and emphasize his helplessness. But there's nothing helpless about this old man's eyes. They still glint their peculiar green-yellow glint from the ruin of his face. The same glint the doctor who's with him first saw many years ago. A look that strikes the doctor, and always has, as being a combination of extreme interest in the world around the man, extreme good humor and intelligence, and always something else. Something he's always wanted to understand, but couldn't, and been deeply wary of. Even if he's honest, sometimes fearful about. The doctor is not surprised that the old man still has this quality about him. Even a casual observer would notice that this isn't just a doctor-patient relationship. It's something in the way the doctor has but his hand on the dying man's hand. In the way they look at each other. They are in fact stepfather and stepson. The doctor is physically the opposite of the old man. He is black and rather short, with the compact thinness of some people whose ancestors come from parts of West Africa. He wears round glasses and has a rather sharp-featured aquiline face. One of the nurses recently described Dr. Brown as rugged, and he supposes he now is. Now he's in his 50s. But as a boy his fine features caused him to get some hassle. They thought he looked girly and bookish, not that they hadn't been able to find other reasons. Or none. It hadn't helped that his first name was Leroy. Even people who were normally okay had laughed at that. He didn't blame them, but it had been his mum's dad's name, and Imani Brown did things her own way. He's a bit like that himself. Long ago, he contemptuously swept aside any notion that the old man on the bed has played the part of white savior in his life. He's got where he is by his own efforts. The help he got from the old man was genuine help. He knows the difference. Dr. Brown knows it won't be long now. His sister, Deja, has been in and said her goodbyes. She does call the man in the bed Dad, something he's never done himself. Bill Pevensey has never seemed to mind one way or another. Deja had completely gone to bits. The successful businesswoman, with kids of her own, completely outflanked. He, however, will stay to the end. The old man is talking, trying to tell him something. Dr. Brown leans in to hear the dying voice. The old man says, "Remember I was capable of other things. They say we're not people like me, but loved you all. You remember that?" Bill Pevensey pauses, struggles to get his breath and gather his fading energies, then says something else to his stepson, Dr. Brown. Speaks a few faint but clear words, and Dr. Brown jerks back, his face a rictus, like a man with a bad tooth who has forgotten it and bitten into something hard. He's not gently taken back through the years. It's as if the dying old man who's spoken was still strong and had smashed him back through them. Everyone had been talking about the killer that year. The papers, TV, and everyone did that thing that Leroy could see straight through. Although he was only 12 and a half, they laid it on thick. We can't express how horrible this business is. It keeps us up nights. We take it home with us. Particularly, our sympathy for the victims and their families. You've got to believe us. With a great big trowel. They did this for the same reason. It also happened on what, in later years, his stepfather called the Hitler Channel. Namely, to disguise that they knew people, themselves included, were almost gleeful in their enthusiasm about hearing about him. and that he was therefore good business. They did it because they knew they should, to cover the enjoyment up. The he in this case being, of course, the killer. The disturbing thing was, it was easy to see why people were interested. The clue was in the nickname the police had given him. Like everyone who does a dirty job, the cops relied on a lot of gallows humor. This name had got into the papers and even on the telly. They called him the Tiger. Firstly, he only went after big game. Specifically, powerfully built white men. He didn't seem to bother necessarily about height. He'd go after short, stocky blokes. It was just that they were all very strong and in the prime of life. Labourers and roofers, brickies on the way home from the pub, men like that. Secondly, they had all been torn apart. It was rumoured but not confirmed that he used his teeth and hands. He had apparently killed 8 men. Privately, the detectives in charge thought it was probably more. No one came out and said it. But it was there, hugely unsaid. The elephant in the room. No women and kids were involved. There'd also been huge controversy when someone on a TV show had commented when they thought their microphone was turned off that there's none of the more unsavoury aspects normally associated with serial killers in this case. An ex-detective had been present and had exploded. There had apparently nearly been punches swung. He'd angrily roared, "Tell that to the last victim's wife and 3 kids." There were lots of jokes about the murders. The elephant in question was a particularly disgusting beast. Some people admired the tiger. Leroy had just been reading about him in the paper, a good quality newspaper he enjoyed. Some of the other kids, who went to the same South London school he attended, had seen him reading it once and given him a hard time. That had been putting it mildly. They'd called him what they always called him, a batty man coconut, and he had made the mistake of remonstrating with them. The fact that his retorts, amongst which had been that they were being racist, were true, had, of course, made the situation worse. The other kids were also black. He'd got beaten up. He only read his newspaper at home now. He'd been deep in thought when his mum had shouted up the stairs that it's time to go to Bill's house. His mother was a South London girl, West Indian on both sides of her family. But when she shouted this, the word house still sounded like ooze. Leroy felt kind of guilty for noticing things like this. But he did. He was dreading today. Although Imani Brown was a force of nature, who held down 3 jobs to support her kids, and who still, somehow, managed to always, somehow, be there for them. Her ability to pick bad boyfriends was uncanny. She'd met this one at a pub she was a barmaid in. Apparently, he was a big white bloke who was away a lot with his landscape gardening business. It was the World Cup this year, and they were going over for a barbecue and the footy. Leroy hated football. Inside his head, he'd already described it as a game of too many halves, an expression he would always be proud of having thought up. He associated it with the boys who made his life hell and picked him last for PE. Also, with the prejudices that said a black boy like him couldn't be interested in the things he was interested in. The only way he would have liked the footy was if it had been teams of girls running around in t-shirts and shorts. He would just go over and keep quiet. Also, like everyone else, Leroy had his own prejudices. This white van man, in both senses of the word, would be someone who was at best uninterested, more probably dismissive about the science fiction and horror movies and books he loved. They always were, just as they always pretended to be nice at first. It turned out that the house was down the back of the playing fields, scene of numerous humiliations for him, besides Leroy's school. It was the middle one of 3. On one side, there was a gay couple called Robert and Alan. On the other side, an old lady called Betty. Leroy later learned from her that long ago she had been in films, just bit parts in comedies that were just like funny postcards. In those days, I was a sort. All 3 of these people had been there in Bill's back garden. Later, it struck Leroy as strange that they were the only ones there. Later, he also wondered, where were all his mates? Where was the loud crap music? At the time, he had been too busy, being taken aback by the man himself. Bill Pevensey was the biggest man he had ever seen. at least 7 feet tall and all muscle, massively wide across the shoulders. He was bearded and had long blonde hair. Leroy was reminded of a book he had, with pictures of Vikings. He found it impossible not to be intimidated. Deja, who was only 3, had already met him. She toddled over to him, and he picked her up. She looked like a tiny doll. Leroy knew this was a good sign. She didn't normally take to new people, and was too young to pretend. England was playing that afternoon, and Bill had hung a George cross out the back window. Imani had rolled her eyes and remarked, "That thing makes me feel really black British, that does." And Bill had taken a swig of his lager and answered, "Well, it is an immigrant's blood that's supposed to be there. So, I suppose that's appropriate." And Leroy surprised himself by asking the huge man what he meant. That was the first time he'd seen what he would always think of as the look. Bill had started to tell him, and one of the old gay guys, Alan, had said, "Oh my, he's gone and done it now. Fairy story time, and not from the old fairies." Everyone had laughed, but Bill had gone on to tell him. The story had been about someone called Joseph of Arimathea. Leroy had asked, "Is that something from all the stuff about King Arthur?" And Bill had grinned and nodded. "That's right. If you want, I can show you the book." Leroy said he would like that. Leroy had looked at his mum and seen her silently laughing my head off at my son face. It occurred to him later that she had known something like this would happen. Later, some other men had turned up, but they didn't stay long, nor did any of them stay long out in the garden. Like most British people, they liked the idea of barbecues more than the reality. When he thought about the day, the word that occurred to Leroy to describe much of it was one of those words that got him bullied for using. Lots of it had been perfunctory, like the flag hanging out the window and the fact that it turned out that Bill, apparently, only watched football when England was in the World Cup. But the books in the room upstairs, which he later learned had once been Bill's mother's room, had been real, and Bill's knowledge and enthusiasm about the books had, most definitely, been real. It matched Leroy's own interest, he could tell. It was as if someone had got a bookshop and taken all the boring stuff out. On handmade shelves that went up to the ceiling were nothing but loads of science fiction and horror books. Also, lots of history and a few classics like Dickens. Bill had loaned him something called The Sword of the Spirits trilogy by John Christopher after learning Leroy had already read the Tripod's books. Deserve to be better known. Those, he said. Over that weekend, Leroy had also devoured a book about the Spartans by a man called Henshaw. Another loan, he'd loved it. And Bill Pevensey had introduced Leroy Brown to a writer called H.P. Lovecraft. This was the 80s. Lovecraft stuff was still deliciously obscure, hard to come by. Like every other enthusiast, Leroy never forgot his first encounter. The day had been a kind of beginning, in more ways than one. William Pevensey had always known that he was a monster, long before he learned the names for people like him, and he had lived all his life among aliens. He grasped early that every human being is always alone, because you can never be inside another person's head. But he suspected other people felt things with more intensity, more immediacy than he did. He imagined that they were all at the opposite end of a tunnel that he was standing in. He was at the dark end, they near the light. Things reached him faintly, even physical sensations, like what he and Imani had when they were alone. And other things, like the voice that said, "Other people are real." That voice was particularly faint. Sometimes, some people seemed more real. They were further down the tunnel, nearer him. Imani and her kids were nearer, and therefore real enough. His mother had been even nearer. But the person who had been the realest, the most vital, had been his father. Luke Pevensey had been so near him, he had loomed over him. This was because William had hated him so much, he remembered. He thought it must be what other people meant when they talked about strong emotions. Books had always reached him, provided an escape. They had for him proximity, immediacy. It amused him that these were the very qualities that people who didn't like them said they lacked. For Bill, they provided a voice that was near him, part of him when he read, but also other, not distant. He loved weird fiction because it helped him to feel something. This was, of course, a sense of wonder. About a year after Imani and the kids moved in, Betty had told his girlfriend that he was a keeper. You want to keep hold of that one. Shouldn't be difficult for you. Your lot have it round the back door. Back in the day, I had it in up top, in the front. And you're a nice, clever girl. Kids are nice. Girl a lovely little thing. Boy polite. Carried me shopping home the other day. Bill's dad now. That was another story. Proper bastard he was. A pig. What Pat and that boy went through was a sin, shame. He once got a load of the boy's books. Little chap then he was. Although it's hard to imagine now, a bit porky he was. Comics and things, even library, and burnt them in the garden, Luke Pevensey. A right nasty piece of work. I don't give a monkey's. It's a good thing he fell down the stairs. Said it, say it again. And I like Bill. Always did. He never saw it. Pat seen. Bill was playing round here with my Robert. This was a lie. Betty had been telling it for so long, she probably believed it. His mother had been her best friend. Bill had, of course, pushed his father down the stairs and broken his neck. Killed him. And he had not killed his father once. He had killed him many times. Could never kill him enough. This was one of the reasons Bill wore a beard. So he didn't have to see Luke Pevensey's face in the mirror. And Imani didn't look like his mother, of course. And there was no chance a boy would ever look like him or his father either. The cat had appeared around this time. It was a huge black-brindled Tom. Although his ears looked in old Betty's words like clothes pegs, they were so tattered, and he only had one bright green eye. His coat looked too thick and healthy for a stray. Where he had appeared from was, and remained, a mystery, as it often does. He started hanging around the back doors, mooching and meowing. Betty put some scraps out for him. Robert and Alan said, "Poor thing," but they were both allergic. It became clear that the cat's preference was Bill's house anyway. They were the chosen ones. At first, it was Imani who was most resistant. Didn't want him in the house as she thought it must be infested. Between them, Deja and the cat won her over. Deja was the first one who he let pat him. She happily put her little star-shaped hands in his fur and said, "Fluffy cats." It looked up at Pevensey and seemed to say, "You see how this is, don't you? I could scratch this little brown human's face open, but I won't, as I hope its mother will give me some chicken." It betrayed itself and rolled over purring. The little girl giggled happily. Soon he was allowed in the house, but only in the kitchen. That was a rule, but it didn't take long before its favourite spot was Leroy's bed. Leroy had, being a fan of Poe, wanted to call him Pluto, because of his coat and his one eye. But he became William instead, because Deja was amused and confused that this was Bill's real name. How this became transferred to the cat was never clear. The cat had the advantage of being a member of a species Bill's father had always detested. Bill was aware that people like him often began to get some of what they needed from doing things to animals. As a small boy, he had, in fact, killed a great many insects and worms, slowly, inventively. But the fact was, he soon stopped. It wasn't enough, never would be. He knew this instinctively. When the animal was established in its chosen kingdom, Imani had rolled her eyes one day and said, "Kids, what you going to do?" Bill, who had never been a child even when he was one, had nodded his agreement. Bill Pevensey found he enjoyed talking about his books with Leroy, having concluded long before that life was essentially meaningless. He valued his books as important. Firstly, because they were no more or less important than anything else he needed. Certainly as important as the violence that made him feel real. Secondly, they were all true within their own internal logics and rules, if they were any good. He didn't keep a book if it wasn't. In this regard, internal truth, there was of course no difference between fiction and history. He particularly remembered certain conversations. Bill said, "Seen you looking at that. The one thing you don't expect from old Adolf is a boring book, but it is. Also, rubbish. I let it stay though. Make an exception there, because it's interesting." Leroy asked a question. Bill responded, "Yay, well, the stuff about culture creators, culture bearers, and culture destroyers is really at the heart. It justifies everything else. Don't need to tell you which one he thought your lot were, but you can't pass as the other. So it was them. That could who he wanted to send to the ovens. It's all rubbish, of course, but it's the kind of rubbish that can convince some people down some pubs, or who would rather burn books." Bill added, "Glad you liked that one. "No, you laughed at Macken's title and that." Leroy asked another question. Bill answered, "No, I don't think the start's boring. All the stuff about good and evil. Remember that gangster film on the telly? Well, just think about how Catholic they all were. Then think about what that Ambrose fellow was saying." Leroy had been taken with Golding's The Inheritors. He said it was amazing how he could go inside the heads of people who weren't really people. Bill had agreed and laughed for reasons of his own. They had lots of other talks, many others. Bill accepted that the boy had the qualities to be a success, with the same coldness that he would have identified those indicating probable failure. As a disaster, Leroy might draw attention. This could be a problem. If he continued to do well at school, he would probably leave for college or university. He already wanted to be a doctor. This would be convenient. Having studied humans as the aliens they were, he thought the odds were probably against this. He had been completely dispassionate about this, and therefore had good insights. The boy's teachers were mostly racists who considered him an exception which proved the rule. They were keen to dismiss him as an aberration, nor were they going to do anything about the persecution he was suffering. Behind the line, "No bullying will be tolerated," was the real belief it was a necessary and inevitable blood sport. Their real job, reasonable crowd control. Also, what did you expect among these kinds of kids? Privately, Bill thought it likely the boy's interests would morph into obsessions. The desire to do what society called good would become a desire for martyrdom. Bill understood this without any understanding or real feeling. He coldly decided it would be inadvisable for him to intervene. One morning, the cat turned up dead in the back garden. It had probably been beaten to death with sticks. Also, it was covered in white paint. Fortunately, Deja never saw him. Bill and Leroy buried William under a bush. Leroy had completely broken down and told him what the worst of his tormentors had said to him just the other day. "Maybe you're going to get the cat you deserve, bounty boy," and laughed and said stuff about Leroy's mum and her boyfriend. Bill missed, as Imani put it, all the fuss that happened a week later. He was away on a job up north. When he wanted, Bill could act the lad, literally. The fact the other men he was working with were secretly all terrified of him helped. They got the job finished early and went on a bit of a bender. They could all have sworn he was with them all the time if they'd ever been asked. They never were. None of them remembered or even suspected the drug-induced unconsciousness. The tiger was cunning. The chief inspector knew the tiger had done it. Although the killings didn't fit the MO, it was, literally, carved onto the 5 black boys' foreheads. They had kept the papers from getting hold of the fact that the tiger carved the letters L and P onto his victims' heads, and he'd been true to form. In this case, all 5 heads had been lined up neatly, just within the goalmouth. On one of the pitches at the back of the high school, all 5 of their owners had irregularly and unenthusiastically attended. The pathologist was also sure, because he pointed out the immense strength that had been involved. He literally twisted their heads off. There were no bodies found, but it got buried. In those days, there was no internet and no mobile phones, and there were other things. Things were still done a certain way. The changes Maggie had brought in barely touched some areas. It must have been difficult, but it had been done. Privately, the chief inspector told his wife it was the Eton mess. The establishment. He knew in his gut what had happened. Some people in one of the London clubs had decided there had been enough trouble recently in the inner cities. So they had also decided it wasn't the tiger. Then they decided to order another bottle of wine that was worth his and his wife's monthly mortgage payment. And later, he knew he'd effectively been bought off. The rest of the investigation, the one he was still permitted to pursue by the big boys, had resources thrown at it. He never got over it, and never caught the tiger. In his fading voice, Bill has whispered to Dr. Brown, "He was a cat from Ulthar." Dr. Brown slowly recovers. He understands now. Finally, at the end, he is able to admit to himself that he has always known, leans forward and talks to the old man, and gently takes his hand in his. In his dying moments, Bill Pevensey invokes the cat from Ulthar, a reference to the Lovecraft story that seems to be his way of finally unveiling the truth to Leroy. This cryptic phrase serves as the key to unlocking the horrifying reality Bill has kept hidden, suggesting secrets and darkness far beyond what Leroy could have imagined. But what is that reference about? To know more about it, click on the video on the left and watch our illustrated and narrated version of Lovecraft's The Cats of Ulthar. Or if you want to discover more of Stephen's works, you can find the playlist dedicated on the right.